Good evening. I'm the programs chair. I'm not your waiter for the evening, so I'd love to, but I can't. Can people in the back hear me? No? No, it's not amplification. This is for Zoom. All right, I'll speak louder. Um, so welcome again. Thank you everyone for coming. This is our first solo program of the fall of 2024. We did a joint program with Atlantic Highlands Historical Society about a month ago that was also about submarines. I think some of you were there. In any case, something to be aware of, this program usually has been on the third Wednesday of the month. That's probably going to shift starting next winter or starting in the winter to Tuesday or Thursday. We'll work it out. We've stepped on a lot of other programs' toes over time, and we want everybody to have a chance to go to everything that's going on. There are so many historical programs going on in our area, especially, that we want to give everybody the chance to do that. So anyway, look out for that announcement. Our next program will be here at Bahrs Landing. It will be also on a Wednesday night. It will be November 20th, and it will be Lost Flights. It's about lost aircraft from World War II and efforts to both locate and recover them, and to identify, in many cases, the pilots and the families involved. So if tonight's program is something that's of interest to you, I'm sure you'll enjoy that as well. We have this season we somehow managed to accrue a whole lot of people who live in Pennsylvania and yet are commuting here to speak. So we're very grateful to our speakers for making the journey. So tonight's speaker is K.A. Nelson. He is a United States Marine Corps veteran. Thank you for your service. And he is the author of this fantastic book, Killing Shore. He is an avid wreck diver. And as I said, he is a native of and resident of the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area. Please help me welcome K.A. Nelson.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I got mine. So that was an excellent introduction. I don't have anything more to say for myself. I haven't even gotten to the jokes yet. As I've said in other presentations, I'm not here to talk about me. So without further ado, we'll get into tonight's story. If the clicker wants to work. IT? It was indeed.
Any light coming from it? You
charge the battery?
Yeah.
Okay.
Brand new battery.
Be right there with you.
Oh, there it goes. Let's go.
No, this is just the laser point.
Let's see if the light's on.
You'll see why the clicker's important. You'll see.
There's always one thing that happens just as we begin the implementation. I don't. No, well, it does. No.
It does, but there's 500 clicks, so I don't want to be tied to the. No.
Right now.
Yep. All right, we got it.
Get the focus.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So, as I was saying, you'll see why the clicker is important here by the end of the show. So, I'm not going to talk a ton about the book. I've seen a few copies of it floating around, which is great. But I just need to provide a little bit of a context for tonight's story. So, this is my book. It came out in April of 2024. It's the first book published to my author name. It was a 3-year project that kind of started on a whim and ended up eventually devouring much of my free time, but that's fine because it was the experience of a lifetime. But the story that we're going to be covering today is an adaptation, really, of a summarized adaptation of 2 chapters from Killing Shore. So the book is structured in 3 parts. The first part is kind of high-level historical background, covers World War I, some of the U-boat operations in the First World War along the East Coast, covers kind of the interwar growth of submarine tactics, but it provides kind of a high-level backstop. At the end of the book, part 3 talks about how the war ends, and then it brings the events up to the present day. So part 3 also talks about the later lives of the book's characters. And I use the term characters, although these are all real people. There's no fiction. There's nothing I invented in this story. So first part's 4 chapters. Third part is 2. The main bulk of the story, what I call the main narrative, is part 2. And that is 11 chapters, each one of which is focused on a different ship, a ship that was involved in an incident along the Jersey Shore related to U-boats. So these 11 chapters in part 2, as well as part 1 and 3, the entire book is interwoven so that it tells one story. So it's not an anthology of stories or a collection of stories. I took the facts and I assembled them together into a single narrative. But what we're going to be talking about tonight is an adaptation of chapters 7 and 8 about the RP Resor and USS Jacob Jones. Just making sure I'm out of everyone's line of sight here. This map I had commissioned for the publication of the book. I got in touch with a very talented artist down in Delaware named Bob Pratt. He did this map for the book, and he also did a U-boat diagram that's toward the middle of the book. This map, which might be hard to see depending on where you're sitting, if you want to see it better, you got to buy the book. This shows every ship, including U-boats, that was sunk in the area pictured during World War II. If World War I were to be included on this map, you would see more than 13 additional markers. And here's where we are. So our story starts on 26 February 1942. This is 6 weeks after the first U-boats reached the East Coast. The intervening time, that 6-week period, has already, just as of 26 February, it has already constituted, those 6 weeks, the worst naval defeat in American history. And the worst is still yet to come. The whole of ships that have been sunk just within 400 nautical miles of the U.S. coast by 6 weeks in, 26 February, that total stands at 36 ships that have been sunk within 400 nautical miles. This does not include sinkings off the Canadian Maritimes, and it does not include sinkings in the Caribbean. The Caribbean U-boat offensive just began a week ago. So just talking about 400 nautical miles out from U.S. coast, we have 36 ships sunk in 6 weeks, and the human toll just associated with the losses so far is already considerable. There were a very wide body of statistics that I realized during the writing of this book that simply had never been calculated. I later learned the hard way why they've never been calculated. But I spent a lot of time collating, producing these statistics myself. It's probably the piece of original research that I'm most proud of from the book. But as I said, we haven't even gotten to the worst of it. So there are many bloody months to follow, but already so far, 6 weeks into it, it's not looking good. So the German offensive along the East Coast is a product of a man named Admiral Karl Dönitz. Dönitz is the founder and commander of the German U-boat fleet, the U-Boot-Waffe. Dönitz would, if his name sounds familiar to some of you, he later succeeded Hitler for about 2 weeks after Hitler's suicide. But Dönitz has a very, he brought with him, when he set up the U-boat fleet in the 1930s, he brought with him some specific tactical and strategic ideas. One of those strategic ideas that he put into action as soon as the war began was he realized that he did not have nearly as many U-boats as he wanted to start the war with. So he realized he had to use these limited resources in the most efficient way possible. So what his strategy becomes in the first half of the war is he will send his U-boats wherever they can sink the most ships at the least risk to themselves. So as a result of this, the first half of the war ends up turning into like a game of whack-a-mole. They're here till that area is locked down, and then they're here, and then they're off West Africa. He's converging his U-boats wherever Allied naval and air forces are the weakest. But he has a problem by November of 1941. He's run out of frontiers to operate in. On December 7th, 1941, that changes completely when the United States is pulled into the war. And as such, he immediately, starting in December, they arrive in January, he immediately throws all the U-boats that he does have available at the East Coast. Now, Sturtevant knew that the East Coast was nowhere near as defended as the Americans wanted it. What he did not know is that, in fact, the situation was even worse or even better for him than he realized. At the time the first U-boats arrived in mid-January of 1942, took them about 3 weeks to cross the Atlantic. By the time they arrived, the East Coast was essentially undefended. There are a number of reasons for this, but when the Germans get here, there are 20 combat vessels and about 70 attack aircraft to defend 1,600 nautical miles of coastline. And most of those aircraft and ships were not really worth a damn. So the door is essentially open when the Germans arrive. Now, as this massacre gets started, the second and third week of January, it becomes clear that there is one near-term solution that could be implemented, but it isn't implemented right away. And that solution is destroyers. There are destroyers that are available running transatlantic convoy duty, and there are other destroyers on patrol in the Gulf and around Latin America. A few of those could have been allocated to the East Coast for anti-submarine duty, but Admiral King does not want to give his permission for that. So after a couple of weeks, it becomes clear that the situation's pretty bad. And King finally relents, sort of. He says, okay, what I'll allow is in between convoy runs, those destroyers that are based out of Canada, I'll allow them to come down to the East Coast for a few days at a time until the next convoy is departing. So as a result, starting in late January, the East Coast gets a few destroyers for a few days at a time. It's really not ideal, but it's slightly better than nothing. So starting in late January, destroyers start kind of rotating through the East Coast on a really ad hoc basis. They're on a few days, they're off a few days, but they get a little bit more of a break on 21 February, when there are 4 destroyers that get assigned temporarily to the East Coast. And 2 of those are detailed to work out of New York City. And those are the USS Dickerson and USS Jacob Jones. Rewind just a few days. Well, actually at about the same time, a few days after. Enter the RP Resource. This is an oil tanker owned by Standard Oil of New Jersey. At the time it was launched in 1936 in Kearney, New Jersey, it was the most advanced ship of its type in the world, most advanced tanker on Earth. It was actually so fancy that it spurred a global revival in tanker construction during the latter part of the 1930s. She had a sister ship, the TC Macabre, and they were launched only a few weeks apart, but the Resource was the one whose name is better known. So the RP Resource, probably because she was so new, she ends up being one of the first beneficiaries of a program that's been taken off the shelf in November of 1941 to arm merchant ships. So the Resource was one of the first American merchant ships that had naval armament outfitted. It was just a single gun, a 4-inch gun at the stern. And there was another platform for a gun at the bow, but because due to a shortage of guns, there's only one that for now that's assigned to the resor, and it's mounted at the stern. So as part of this effort to arm ships, which started in November with the repeal of was it Clause 6 of the Neutrality Act, the Navy also resurrects a World War I era program called the Armed Guard program. And what the Armed Guard is it assigns gunners to merchant ships to man these guns. For a couple of reasons, they couldn't have the merchant mariners do it. So ships like the Resor that have guns also have a small Navy detachment aboard. So the Resor's detachment was 9 sailors, there was 1 officer and 8 enlisted, and they had just come aboard, I think, on the 14th or 15th of February. So they're brand new aboard ship. As I said, 9, and their entire job, their entire role aboard the ship was to operate the gun if and when it was ever needed. So the night of 26 February 1942, the RP Resort is making her way north along the New Jersey coast. As the hour draws close to midnight, she is 16 miles east of, what the heck was she? Drawing a blank on exactly the city, but she's about, no, a little farther south than that. Anyway, she's about 16, 17 miles off the coast and northbound. She's en route from Port Arthur, Texas to Fall River, Massachusetts, with a cargo of 105,000 barrels of Bunker C fuel oil. Bunker C isn't used much these days, but back at this era, it was used to power locomotives and ships. It was Bunker C is what you get after you distill out like kerosene and gasoline. It's almost like crude oil. It's really thick like molasses. One of the men aboard is a 46-year-old named John Forsdahl. Forsdahl is a Norwegian immigrant to the United States. He has been at sea for most of his life. He survived 2 U-boat attacks during the First World War. His mailing address and where his wife and son live is San Francisco, California. Forsdahl is standing his lookout post on the forecastle of the ship, which is that raised platform up near the bow. Another man that's aboard is 27-year-old Daniel Hay from New York City. Hay has only been in the Navy for 3 months, but he is already the ranking NCO of that 9-man detail. So he's the second most senior of those 9 armed guard sailors aboard. Hay is at this moment just getting ready to go to bed in the aft crew quarters, as you can see, conveniently located right next to the gun. Ship's making its way north. Hay is in the aft crew quarters. John Forsdahl is on lookout duty at the forecastle up near the bow. Also up near the bow or on the forecastle is that second gun platform that I mentioned. There's no gun on it because there's a shortage of weapons, but the platform is still there. There are actually 4 men that are on duty right now, but Forsdahl is the only one up here on the bridge. So there's an officer and 2 other unlicensed crewmen on the bridge here. So Forsdahl's on the forecastle. There's 3 more on duty on the bridge inside, and there's another Navy sailor up here on the monkey bridge. There's also another Navy sailor at the gun back here, but Forsdahl is alone up here. The ship, like most tankers, has 4 lifeboats. There's 2 on either side of the midship house, and then 2 more on either side of the aft deck house. And most of the space inside the hull, as you can see here, is comprised of 7 tanks, which are carrying that 105,000 barrels of Bunker C fuel oil. Time is 23:26. Forsdahl wasn't even sure what happened at first. He's standing his post, and the next thing that he realizes, it's like the deck comes up and strikes him from below. He's thrown off of his feet and goes tumbling across the deck toward the bow. We're 1 second, 2 seconds into this. Right as he starts to get his bearings, maybe 3 seconds, Forstall realizes that there is fiery debris falling out of the sky. It's landing all around him, pieces of metal, pieces of wood. He, thinking fast, he scrambles under that gun platform for a few seconds while he waits for this squall to abate. As he's hiding under this platform for 5 seconds, 6 seconds, maybe 7 seconds after the explosion, he notices two things. Firstly, he notices that the night air around him, the night sky, has suddenly become a little bit lighter. Remember, it's almost midnight. Second thing that he notices is waves of heat washing over him. Now, Forstall has, like I said, he's survived 2 U-boat attacks in the last war, but when he climbs out from under that gun platform, he takes him a few seconds to process what he sees. The midship house of the RP Resor is fully engulfed in a 150-foot pillar of fire. He, first thing he realizes is that the 2 lifeboats on either side of the midship house are now out of the equation. He knows that his only chance to get to a lifeboat is to somehow get past those flames. So what he does is he approaches the fire to see if there's any way past it to get to the stern of the ship. As he gets a little bit closer, he realizes 2 things. 1, there's no way past the flames. And 2, that fire is expanding forward and aft. He is very quickly running out of room at the front of the ship. The flames are pushing him toward the bow. Realizing that he does not have a lot of time, he finds a life raft that were basically mounted so that they could trip a pelican hook and it slides down right into the water. So he drops a raft overboard. He then puts a rope over the hull as these flames are continuing to advance, and he climbs hand over hand down the rope. Within a few minutes, he is swimming out to sea. Now, rewind the clock back 1 or 2 minutes. That explosion that sends Forstall tumbling across the deck also woke up Daniel Hay in the aft crew quarters. Hay springs into action immediately. As I mentioned, the whole reason that these sailors are aboard this merchant ship is to man the gun. The Navy doctrine said very plainly that the ship is to be defended with every means for as long as possible. So regardless how bad the damage is, until the merchant captain orders everyone off the ship, it's their job to get to that gun and man their station. So Hay gears up as fast as he can, gets the other guys, gets them in gear, rushes up to the deck. But when Daniel Hay reaches the aft deck, that's when he realizes that there's not going to be any shootout with the Germans, because the first thing he sees when he comes out is that wall of flame, and it is coming toward him very quickly. There is complete pandemonium on board now. There was, in addition to the 9 armed guardsmen, there are 41 merchant mariners as well. And there was a complete breakdown of any semblance of order. So Hay realizes very quickly that he's not getting to the gun. He'll be lucky if he gets out with his life. So he and 3 other men go to the number 3 lifeboat, which is on the starboard side of the ship. So it's the same side that Forstall entered the water on. They get to the number 3 lifeboat only to find that it is already full and is already in the process of being launched. That's not a picture from this incident. The lifeboat's full, they're already lowering it. Him and the other 3 now go around to the number 4, or this was the number 3 on this side. They go around to the number 4 boat on the port side. So we only have a 2-dimensional view here, but he was on the same side Forstall entered on, and now he's around the other side. They get the gripes loosened, and they start to winch the boat out over the side of the hull, but they're already out of time. That fire is approaching faster and faster. Hay and the other 3 men do the only thing they can do, which is they jump overboard from the aft port side. All three of them end up in the water, but their situation is not really improved from where they are now because the fuel oil hemorrhaging from those ruptured tanks has now also caught fire. It was Hay who saw a small gap in the flames and he starts to swim for it. He's the most fit of the four guys. The other three follow behind him, and Hay is swimming toward this gap in the flames. It's getting smaller and smaller as he approaches. Now, at about the same time, ashore, it was a Coast Guard watchtower that saw this little ominous glow on the horizon. They call it in to Coast Guard Station Manasquan Inlet, and where on duty is Chief Bosun's mate John Daisy. He's the hefty fellow there on the right. Daisy is on duty with 5 or 6 of his men. He gets into action immediately. He grabs Thomas Evans and Oswald Etheridge, and they get into one of the station's picket boats. There's going to be another picket boat from Manasquan Inlet that follows them about 5 to 10 minutes later. And Shark River Station is also going to send a boat. But other than these few motorboats coming from shore, there's no other help that's going to be on scene for quite some time. So for the time being, by morning, there's going to be blimps and every cutter in the Northeast converging on the scene. But for right now, just past midnight, these guys are the only hope for anyone that might be alive at the resort. Now, I should mention that Chief Daisy, he was what we would call salty. He has seen and done pretty much everything there is to see and do in the Coast Guard. He's rescued flood victims in Pennsylvania. He has worked the Great Lakes. He has been in 2 shootouts with prohibition smugglers. This is the time to make a joke. Like, look at him. He's 24 years old. Look how he looks. So I don't know his age offhand, but he's certainly younger than he looks. He's been there, done that. But nothing that he has done up to this point has prepared him for what he is about to experience. There's no photos of the resort from up close that night. The words that Daisy and the other Coast Guards have been used to describe what they saw really kind of beggar belief. And I wish I had a picture, but this is really kind of the best I can do. Even at top speed, it takes them about an hour to get out to the resort. And when they do, they find not only is the sea on fire, because that bunker C oil is bleeding across the surface of the ocean, and it's now stretching about 500 meters aft of the ship, but the fire inside the cargo tanks of the resort is burning so hot that the hull of the ship is glowing white. Now, I should mention the resort was 440 feet long, 60 feet wide a beam, and fully loaded. Like tonight, she's got about 35 feet of freeboard, and it's glowing white. There are jets of fire that are shooting out of holes that are forming in the hull as the steel deteriorates. That oil that's burning on the surface of the ocean is creating an enormous amount of smoke and fumes. Now they're breathing that in. They're gagging, they're coughing, they're on the verge of throwing up, and they can't see a single sign of life. Eventually, they hear one man calling for help. It is, they can't even tell what he looks like. He's so covered in oil. The nature of how oil works if you're swimming through it is it tends to congeal on you, especially if it's molasses like this type of oil is. So this one person, they hear his voice, they manage to find him in the water, and they can't get him onto the boat because he weighs almost 500 pounds. They're in first-class hernia territory, trying to haul him up onto the picket boat. He's too heavy. They can't. Eventually, they put a rope around him and try to tow him out, but that forces his head under and almost drowns him. Eventually, the 3 of them are able to muscle this one victim aboard. They then go around to the other side of the resort, And there they find there's actually a Navy subchaser that has showed up on scene, and they are trying to get a second survivor off of a raft. The Navy guys are unsuccessful, so Daisy, Evans, and Etheridge, actually the two younger guys, jump off the picket boat onto the raft and actually help pull this guy, the second survivor, up onto the picket boat. Chief Daisy had to lean over the gunwale and cut the guy's clothes off him to get him in. And then this is now 03, thereabouts, and rescue work will continue throughout the hours of darkness into the dawn. And this brings us up to the morning of 27 February. Remember, we started yesterday on the 26th. Now, ashore, there is a first aid station, kind of a triage center that's been set up by the Red Cross and some local volunteers. That center, those facilities, however, will not really be needed because the locals were expecting this influx of burned and wounded men. But of the 50 men aboard the RP Resor, only Daniel Hay and John Forsdahl survived. This is them being cleaned up with kerosene at Coast Guard Station Manasquan Inlet on the morning of the 27th. Now, at the same time, on the morning of the 27th, which was, I think it was a Friday, don't quote me on that, there are crowds of people gathering along the coast at places like Asbury Park to watch the RP Resor. She continues to burn offshore. The ship is obviously abandoned. It's not under anyone's power. You can see the intensity of the heat has buckled it into that V shape. That's right where the fire was burning the hottest. And now it's just drifting down the coast as it continues to smolder. And there are enormous crowds of people that are gathering to watch this spectacle. There's also a local journalist, a guy named E. Burke Maloney, who wrote for the Asbury Park Press. He and a few other newsmen end up paying a local fisherman to take them out closer to the wreck in his fishing boat. The fishing captain's name was Andrew Larson. So Larson takes these journalists out, and they were, I believe, the only people to get pictures up close of the wreck. So I think they took both of these. This was an aircraft took these. I think Maloney's boat took that, but they even got a little bit of footage. That's the Resor up close around early afternoon of the 27th. Perpetrator was the U-578. This was the first Type 7 U-boat to operate along U.S. shores. The commander of U-578 is a gentleman named Ernst August Rehwinkel. Rehwinkel was 40 years old, which was ancient by U-boat commander standards. I'm old by U-boat commander standards. The average age was about 28, 29. I still don't know why a 40-year-old was commanding a U-boat, but this was Rehwinkel's first ever sinking. So quite a big deal aboard the boat. Despite it being Rehwinkel's first sinking, the actual work was done by his second in command, 22-year-old Raymond Tiesler. The way that U-boats operated when they were attacking from the surface, it would really be the first watch officer's show. He was the second in command, equivalent to an executive officer in the U.S. Navy. The first watch officer really ran the surface attacks. Submerged attacks would be the commander's domain. But at this phase of the war, the U-boats attack from the surface whenever possible. So it was really Tiesler that actually fired 2 torpedoes. One of them didn't hit. It probably ran deep. But as I mentioned, quite a big deal. Rehwinkel in his log notes that all sorts of shouting and cheering from the crew when they saw that flame erupt from about 1,300 yards away, confirming that they got their first kill. He recorded in his log, after he noted the ship does not need another torpedo, it's burning like a bonfire, it's done. He turns south, and as he says in his log, goes south with the expectation of additional ships. So he head south from where he was operating off North Jersey. Now, U-boats that were operating in U.S. waters, usually what they would do is they would be active at night, and then during the daytime, they would go down to the seafloor and just wait. They would literally nap, do maintenance, but daylight, much more dangerous to be operating. So they usually operated at night. Usually daytime was they would just find a place 300, 400 feet down and just chill out for the day. But Rehwinkel doesn't do that. What he does instead is he continues south at full speed until the sun starts to rise on the 27th, and he submerges and continues south on his electric motor. So he's moving at like walking pace, but he is so jazzed up from destroying the RP Resor, he doesn't even take daylight hours off. He continues to go south throughout the 27th. Now enter USS Jacob Jones. This was the ship mentioned earlier. The Jacob Jones, or as she was known to her crew, the Jakey, was a World War I vintage ship. She was actually launched just a few days after the armistice in 1918. So, like most ships of her vintage, was finished too late for action in the last war. The Jacob Jones was a Wickes class destroyer. There were three very similar classes: Wickes, Caldwell, and Clemson. They all looked like this, kind of an old-fashioned look. They were called four pipers because of their four smokestacks. And they were also called flush deckers because, as you can see, there's no forecastle. It's just kind of straight all the way back. These were quite old pieces of equipment by 1942, but they still have a lot of value to them. There's still a lot of utility and a lot of need. There's just not enough destroyers for the Allies anywhere on planet Earth. So they need every reasonably operational ship they can get. So these are outdated, but still useful. Now, this was not the first USS Jacob Jones. There had been one prior, DD-61, naval vessels to fight in World War I. Unfortunately, DD-61, England in December 1917. More than half the crew was killed. I think there was 44 survivors. They were rescued because the U-boat commander radioed their position. There would have been more survivors, except when the ship sank, her depth charges went off and killed a number of men in the water. So as I mentioned, the Wickes class destroyers, they're old, but they're still plenty good, especially for anti-submarine work. These comprise most of the U.S. fleet in this phase of the war. So 1942, they were pulling at least half of the destroyer weight. So even though they're ugly old ships that don't really get talked about much, they were hugely important for this phase of the war. Engineering of them is pretty unremarkable. The Jakey's got crew berthing for all ranks up front. Below that, there's the fuel oil bunkers and the magazine where the ammunition's stored. The engineering spaces are all amidships. There is a large enlisted crew quarters near the stern. There's depth charge rack above. There's also two depth charge launchers that aren't shown on this. Additionally, there is a structure amidships called the galley deckhouse, which includes, as you'd imagine, the galley. That's it. It was a pretty ordinary design for a ship of her type. Commanding there was 149 men aboard the Jakey. The senior most among them was the captain, Lieutenant Commander Hugh Black from Oradell, New Jersey. One of the radiomen is Radioman Third Class Albert Oberg. The junior most officer aboard the ship is a 22-year-old named Norman Smith from Vermont. He just graduated from the Naval Academy a few weeks earlier. There's a guy from Alabama named Paul Tidwell, fireman second class. The ship's doctor, Lieutenant Junior Grade Benjamin Bronstein, and a ship fitter third class from Mercer, Pennsylvania, named Wilbur Rhodes. Rhodes, known to his friends as Dusty. Dusty Rhodes had been a volunteer firefighter and star athlete back in his hometown in Western PA. So, by coincidence, the Jakey leaves for patrol the less than 12 hours after the RP Resor gets hit. So she leaves New York Harbor. At this point, the Resor is still burning. The fire is kind of burning itself out. She leaves at 11:30. Now, no sooner has the Jakey left port that they actually get a radio message from headquarters telling them to link up with the Dickerson, which was the other destroyer that's also operating out of New York. Their instructions are to do a joint patrol for a while, and then they're going to divide the patrol area where the Jacob Jones is going to take everything from Beach Haven up to New York. I'm sorry, the Dickerson will take Beach Haven up to New York, and then the Jacob Jones will take Beach Haven down to Cape May Point. So they proceed south, midday, early afternoon. At 15:30 that afternoon, they come across the Resor, still just drifting south as there's the fire's mostly out by this point. The two ships search the area for any additional survivors. They do not find anything. And after their commanders talk between themselves, it's agreed that the Dickerson is going to turn north and begin patrolling her half of the AO, and the Jacob Jones will continue searching around the Resor for a little while longer. So the Dickerson departs and goes north. The Jakey runs search patterns for the next 2 hours, but once again, there are no signs of life from the RP Resor that are sighted. Eventually, by the time the sun is going down, there's a Navy tugboat showing up on scene to tow the Resor away. As the tugboat starts getting to work, the Jacob Jones continues on her patrol. She spends the evening southbound in radio silence. Her orders from headquarters not to transmit anything. So she's heading south. At some point after midnight, she passes Cape May and doubles back north, which brings us into the early morning hours of 28 February. And it's at this point, at about 04:25, that the USS Jacob Jones encounters none other than the U-578, which has been, as mentioned, creeping south throughout the entirety of the daylight hours. Now, I should mention that submarines of this era, more often than not, would not go out of their way to attack a destroyer. The analogy I'd used before is it's a little bit like taking a shot at a grizzly bear, right? Depending on the circumstances, I might just want to let bear go about his business. So in the majority of circumstances, a U-boat or any submarine is going to kind of tiptoe away from an encounter like this, but not Ravenkel, not today, because his blood is still hot from getting his first kill the previous evening. So he orders the crew to battle stations. Now, the Jakey is still headed north. The Americans have not sighted the U-boat at this point. So the Jakey is seen by the Germans at 04:25. They start moving into an attack position, getting ahead of the boat. And it's at 04:55 when Paul Tidwell has just ventured up from his duty station in the engine room to put sugar in his coffee. So he is up in the galley deck house. What Tidwell does not know is that at that moment, Raymond Tiesler has the galley deck house lined up in his targeting optic. he fires 2 torpedoes. There's a fan, meaning there's one order to launch given, and the trigger is initiated once. One torpedo launches, and 2.3 seconds later, the second one launches. The first torpedo strikes just below the superstructure, and strikes just below the superstructure. These ships, these destroyers, were called tin cans for a reason. They had very thin hulls. Destroyers are supposed to be fast. Not like a battleship, there's no armor. That first torpedo tears open the hull and ignites the ordnance in the magazine, sparking a much larger explosion that shears off everything forward of the number 1 stack. Everyone on the bridge, including Lieutenant Hugh Black, is killed instantly. All the chief petty officers are killed instantly. All but one of the officers are also killed. 5 seconds later, the second torpedo strikes under the aft crew quarters. This blows away most of the ship's aft 40 feet above the keel plates. Of the men that are asleep in the crew quarters, the only survivor is Albert Oberg. It killed the man in the bunk above him. What is left of the Jacob Jones now slides to a halt. Her entire forward end has been completely severed. It's actually today, that part of the wreck is quite a distance away from the rest of it. But the dazed surviving crew begin congregating on deck. One of them is a guy named George Pantal from the engine room, and he would later recall being surprised at his first thought when he came out on deck was, where is everyone? He only sees about 30, 35 other shipmates. What he does not know is that 110 to 115 Americans have been killed in that 5-second span. Compounding the situation is the fact that those that are left alive are mostly more junior ratings. So there's nobody above an E6. So there's nobody alive that would normally be expected to take charge in a situation like this. So they're completely without direction. Also, a number of them are obviously very badly wounded. The deck is covered in oil. There are fires burning everywhere. And the ship, what's left of the ship, is afloat for now, but she is taking on water and she will end up going down in about an hour. But the ship is going down. The water is about 34 degrees. That's a death sentence. And it's at this point that the Jakey's unlikely hero steps forward. It is shipfitter 3rd class Wilbert Dusty Rhodes. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he takes charge of the survivors and leads an effort to get the lifeboats launched. The problem is they can't be launched. They find out the hard way that they can't get the first boat off because there is the skids are damaged, or the davits are damaged, and there's too much oil on the deck. They can't get traction to get this boat launched. He sends what few able-bodied men he has to the other lifeboat, and that one has been jammed on its skids by the force of the explosion. Meanwhile, the ship is continuing to slouch lower in the water. Eventually, Dusty orders them to the life rafts instead. Now, it's about this time when a figure staggers out on deck and collapses. It isn't clear who it is at first. He's so badly wounded. This guy has all of his exposed skin has been flash burned. His eyes are almost black from all the capillaries being ruptured. His eardrums have been blown out. He's completely deaf. It is 22-year-old Norman Smith. He is the only officer to survive the initial explosions. He is described by survivor accounts as completely incoherent at all times. Meanwhile, the ship is continuing to sink, but under Dusty's leadership, they do manage to get several life rafts launched. There's a couple of them that are in the water on this side, another one on the other side. One of the rafts they hold against the hull, and they're able to keep it there, and they start lowering people down onto it. One of the first people to get lowered down on was Ensign Smith. He is by this point screaming in agony. Ship continues taking on water. Eventually, as it gets lower, most of the remaining people on board jump overboard and start swimming to one of the rafts. As the ship goes down, there's still a few men that are seen on deck. The last living memory of Dusty Rhodes was he was still leading the evacuation in the last minutes. The ship eventually goes down over what was her bow, so she tips this way, allowing these survivors in the water to see the full extent of the damaged aft. The ship stands up almost vertically on what had been her bow and goes down. The Jakey is gone. Sun is by this point beginning to rise. There's about 30 men in the water. Some are on rafts, some are swimming to a raft. But it's at this point that the survivors' travail gets even worse. Because as the Jacob Jones is sinking beneath them, their depth charges start to go off. Each one of these Mark 7 depth charges entails a main charge of 600 pounds of TNT. Probably only the ones on the racks went off. That's still at least 12. Now, the properties of water as compared to air are as follows. When there's an explosion on dry land, as the shock front radiates outward, it compresses air molecules, and as a result, bleeds its strength pretty quickly. If you were to graph it as a curve, the strength of an explosion peaks and recedes pretty quickly on dry land. Even when that explosion hits you, even if it kills you, the pressure difference or the density difference between skin and air means that even your body will reflect some of that blast energy away. Might not be enough to save you, but an explosion on land loses a lot of its force very quickly. Unlike air, water is incompressible. And if you ever heard a noise underwater in a swimming pool or something, you'll notice that it sounds louder. That's because the same principle that makes those sounds louder underwater also allows explosive energy to be transmitted over much longer distances with much more force. This is what hits these survivors while they're in the water. Now, an explosion shockwave moving through water actually moves through soft tissue without causing much damage. It'll go through your biceps and things like that, your musculature, without really hurting you very much. But not the parts of the human body that are filled with air. Stomachs, lungs, sinuses, inner ears get crushed immediately as the shock wave passes through it. And the men in the water are at the full mercy of all of these explosions that are going off directly underneath. Eventually, the grave of the Jacob Jones finally falls silent for good. And when it does, there are a lot fewer than 30 men left alive. Everyone on that crowded raft was killed. Ensign Smith was killed. A few men survived because they were in the water hanging onto the raft, and the raft and the bodies on it absorbed most of the blast. Fortunately, the men that are left alive at this point are sighted by an aircraft pretty shortly after, and they are held out of the water by those rafts that Dusty's effort launched. Otherwise, they would not have survived until later that morning, when they were finally picked up by another old World War I vintage ship, a sub-chaser called the Eagle 56. Picks them up at around 9:30, 10. Searches for any other survivors, can't find any, and a few of those men that were recovered were rather badly wounded. So the Eagle 56 was actually towing a raft with some bodies on it and had to cut that raft loose to make best possible time back to Cape May. Of the 149 men, and this brings us to the morning of 28 February, Of the 149 men aboard USS Jacob Jones, 11 returned to shore on 28 February. They arrived at Section Base number 9 at Cape May. Little bit of poetic justice. So the USS Jacob Jones was part of Destroyer Division 54. There were 3 other destroyers in that division. One of them was USS Roper. Roper ends up taking over for the Jacob Jones East Coast patrol duties. And exactly 6 weeks after the loss of the Jakey, the Roper bags the first U-boat destroyed in U.S. waters. This was the U-85, was sunk off the Outer Banks on 14 April. Fast forward a few decades, Paul Tidwell survived that day. He later retired from the Navy as a chief. His grandson, Eric, also joined the Navy and became an F-18 naval flight officer, so the backseat guy. That's Eric on the left and Paul. Picture was taken in 2010 or 2011. And Eric Tidwell wanted to do something special while his grandfather was still alive. And what he did is in July of 2011, Eric dove the wreck of the Jacob Jones. This is not a very frequently dived wreck. It's basically, I would call it a forgotten New Jersey wreck. So it doesn't get visited very often. A local dive shop called Atlantic Divers actually took him out there at no cost. They also turned it into kind of like a media event. So the whole family, it was kind of a family reunion ashore. Paul Tidwell returned to New Jersey for the first time since that incident. And he and his family were at one of the watchtowers, the World War II towers down at Cape May, and they had a bunch of newspapers come out and do some photo ops where some of these things came from. And it was a successful venture, and Eric got to spend about 23, 24 minutes on what is left of the Jacob Jones, which is not really all that much today. Ladies and gentlemen, that is my song and dance. That is all I have for you. I appreciate it. I appreciate thank you. I appreciate your time. I know that your time is valuable, and I very much appreciate that you'd go to all the trouble to come out and hear me talk about this very uplifting stuff. So thank you all very much. That's all I got. We'll now go to Q&A until someone cuts me off. Sir.
Is that in a period that the shore lights are still on?
Yes. I will say, and the Killing Shore does cover that topic. I will say that the shore lighting issue has been kind of overstated. It was a problem, and it did help the Germans, but it wasn't nearly as big a help as it's kind of been projected to be since then. So, yeah, the lights were still on. There's kind of a complicated explanation of why, and it was not good, but it's been overblown. But yes. Sure. Mm-hmm. So good question. So it's at about 130 feet. So you can do it if you're on the experienced end of the recreational side. There's not a lot left to see, and not everyone necessarily geeks out on the history side of these things the way I do. Whenever my buddies and I do an annual dive trip to North Carolina, and I always want to see the history-oriented wrecks, and they always want to see like they have other priorities. So I think the fact that because it's on the deeper side of recreational depth, and there's not a lot left, and it's kind of a forgotten story to begin with, it's just kind of brain dumped. But there's no one specific reason for it. So thank you. I will. I had a sonar picture. Yep. You can see as she went down, that the first stack was already knocked over. The next one toppled off, or maybe when she hit the bottom. But no problem. Next, plaid shirt. Sure. So a destroyer has every single advantage over a submarine, period, except circumstances depending, surprise. So a destroyer is faster, a destroyer is much better armed, a destroyer can stay on station indefinitely, and a submarine can do none of those things. So if a submarine of any navy takes a shot at a destroyer or a big cutter or something like that, essentially what can happen is if it doesn't kill that thing immediately, well, now they are forced underwater. They are at the mercy of depth charges. They can't really hit back. You can't do it when you're submerged at a significant depth or on the bottom. There's nothing you can do to an enemy above. So what you want to do is if you're going to be bold and attack a destroyer or a Coast Guard cutter, you want to fire a fan of like 3 or 4 and make sure that that grizzly bear is dead immediately. Because if you miss or if it doesn't go your way, you're in a bad situation without an immediate reprieve. Yep.
They have the technology to listen to.
Yeah. Yes, they did, but like any technological tool, it's not a silver bullet. It has its limitations. So it's a really valuable asset, but there was thinking in the interwar years when sonar really came about in like the 1920s, and there was a school of thought that, oh, now the submarine's been totally neutral. No, it can't, because sonar, especially sonar of that era, was a very valuable tool, but it had significant limitations as well.
One question online.
Online.
What happened to the crew that escaped the tanker on the boat?
The 2 guys?
No, the crew, the other boat.
Oh,
the
no, there was no sign of it ever seen. In fact, and this is the 3rd presentation in a row I've gotten this question, so I'm going to start addressing it preemptively. So when they found the first survivor, that was Daniel Hay. And what Daniel Hay said as soon as they got him into the picket boat is, I saw this fully loaded lifeboat, the number 4, going off on the other side. That's why Daisy went around the other side of the Resource. He was looking for that boat. No trace of that lifeboat or its occupants were ever found. How many more online questions we got? Okay, let's hit it.
Person just wants to know closest towns where these sinkings occurred.
You get me on the one thing that I drew a blank on earlier. It's yeah, Manasquan would be a close one. Asbury Park was close-ish. It was North Jersey is where it was attacked, but then it drifted south. So when the Jacob Jones caught up with it, it was down closer to like Beach Haven. It was just drifting all day. Sir. How far off? 16, 17 miles. Yes. Yep. So each one of those torpedoes was 23 and a half feet long, total weight about 3,500 pounds. And of that, the warhead is 600 and change pounds. And that was, it was called hexanite. It was a TNT-based explosive, but it was laced with powdered aluminum. So it was even more powerful than like the regular TNT that the U.S. was using at the time. We have a question over here. Yes. So they did not need any resupply, either the Type 7 or the Type 9, to come to the East Coast and work for a couple weeks. Later on in 1942, getting into like the May timeframe, when the East Coast becomes less permissive. Remember one of the first things I said is Dernitz's strategy is he just goes for whatever the weak point on the map is. Well, after a few months of this, finally, the U.S. East Coast is not so permissive for the U-boats as it's been. So Gurnett starts looking for the next place on the map, which ends up being the Gulf of Mexico. He just keeps going south. To get to the Gulf of Mexico, they do need resupply. And that's when the Type 14 was called the Milk Cow. It was basically a giant resupply U-boat, and those started being used in April of this year, so just a couple months after this. But they did not need any resupply to get to the East Coast or the Caribbean. In the back. Good question. He asked, why were the depth charges armed? I don't know. But at this incident, similar incidents like this, it happened enough. There was another bad one at Midway with the USS Hammond that eventually they figured out the arming. That's actually a great question. I have never been able to find a good answer to that. But this was evidently a big enough issue that at some point early in the war, measures were taken, because you don't hear about it happening much later in the war. But the two instances that come to mind, there was the first Jacob Jones, the second Jacob Jones, and then USS Hammond at Midway had the same problem. Great question. I've never been able to find it. If you find out, email me through my website. I'd love to know. I'm serious. Good question, though.
The U-boat that sank, there's 5 or more, or did you make it through the war?
In August 1942, the U-578 disappeared in the Bay of Biscay. It is, to date, one of 61 U-boats whose loss cannot be attributed to any known event. For a long time, the boat's destruction was attributed to a Czechoslovak Royal Air Force squadron, but within the last few years, it was determined that that was a different U-boat. So we still don't know what happened to U-578. It was crossing the Bay of Biscay outbound and just gone. Well, 61 are gone without historians being able to figure out what happened. Some of those were just mechanical, probably the majority of them. But sometimes there's an attack and it doesn't get reported right, or the decades after the war, nerds like me are like matching stuff up and trying to, and those are the few that they haven't figured out yet. When you say missing boats,
Just the US subs.
Well, yeah, so there were, I don't know how many US subs are missing. I know we lost a total of 48, 52. I don't know. I'm not sure how many of those are still unaccounted for, but yes. All of these were based out of France, occupied France, because that gives them direct access to the Atlantic. They don't have to go around Great Britain. And that was a huge benefit to them when the Germans overran France. Suddenly, just think about Germany's coasts. I was just there in June in Kiel. Like, I wasn't sailing around in the thing, but there's not really, like, it's hard to get out to the Atlantic without going around Britain. Once they took France, they can just leave directly from the French coast. They didn't need to for the East Coast. It would be about 2 to 3 weeks over, about, we'll say 1 to 2 weeks on station, depending on how much running around they're doing and how fast they go through the torpedoes. Another couple of weeks back. This 4 to 6 weeks, depending on a few things, but sure. I'm glad you mentioned. I actually cut it out for length, but Rusty Rhodes, today he has a VFW named after him, and that's it. But that's it. He's basically, until I put his name, and if you Google Wilbur Dusty Rhodes, 90% of the hits will just take you back to that book. He's basically forgotten. If you go to my website, there is a link. I am doing what I can to get Dusty nominated for a Valor Award. I'm pulling a few different levers. One of the 4 or 5 lines of effort is a petition change.org. So if you care about Dusty or this kind of stuff, please check out my website, go to that link and just sign. You can do it anonymously. It's just one of several tools I'm trying to throw in someone's desk.
One more question on mine.
Yeah.
Does your book cover the role of civilian soldiers on shore during the war?
Not really. No. Last one. Yeah, you, sir. Yeah, no, thank you. I would love to, I'd love to grope that. Um, last thing I was going to say. So, usually this question comes up, or I'd say usually, first few times I did this story, this question came up in other stories as well. But there's, so I didn't get it, so I'm not timing anyone out. I will say that there are very pervasive stories about U-boat crewmen coming ashore and U-boats going up rivers. Absolutely none of that happened. I'm telling you, I spent 3 years going this deep into this stuff. They never came ashore except as POWs. So if anyone ever, you can pop someone's bubble if they ever try to tell you some nonsense story. It's like, I went to this guy and he said it didn't happen. So it didn't happen. That's all I got. Thank you again for coming out. Thank you for the questions.
So Killing Shore available from a bookseller near you. Unfortunately, this copy is spoken for. If you happen to have it and would like Kay to sign it, come on up after we're done. Just a couple of things before we go. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation and you're not a member of NMHA, you can sign up before you leave. Okay, we have applications at the back. Lynn will be happy to assist you with the application and with the fee. It's not a lot of money and it really helps us out a lot. Similarly, if you can't be bothered filling out any forms tonight, there's a suggested donation jar back there. So drop us a couple of bucks and we'll be very grateful for it. So as Rick said, we have the Maritime Meetup coming up. So at the very least, please sign up for the newsletter so that we can tell you all about the Maritime Meetup, when it's going to meet us there. And then on November 20th, which again is a Wednesday night, right here in this room will be Lost Flights, Joe Fiorentino, talking about lost aircraft off the New Jersey coast, the efforts to recover them, and the efforts to identify the brave men who flew in them. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you next month. And thank you, Zoomers. Sir.
Thank you very much.
No, I don't know.
I don't take this off now. I will go home with.
Yeah, the whole night.